Good afternoon and good evening, everybody. And my name is Akiyoshi Yonezawa from Tohoku University, Japan. And thank you again for the Professor Hugo Ota, Professor Jason Jun, and Monique and I for the arranging this wonderful opportunity. So the today's talk is by the Dr. Daniel Levy, and let me introduce Dr. Daniel Levy briefly. So Dr. Daniel Levy is a distinguished professor at the State University of New York, SUNY, Albany. And in addition to his position in the Department of Education Policy and Leadership at the university, Dr. Daniel Levy is the founder and the director of the so-called PROFET, a program for research on private higher education. And this is a global scholarly network established in 2000, if I'm correct. And it is really honored that I am the one of the early affiliated member of this network. And earlier this year, Dr. Levy published his ninth book, A World of Private Education, Higher Education. This is on the left side of the, which is published by the Oxford University University Press. And he is also the leading general editor of the Prophet book series of the global higher education literature. And the first book it is our honor that about Asia, and that is co-edited by the Professor Kang Chao of the National University of Vietnam, Hanoi, and myself. And so today, this is a really good opportunity to know the kind of very detailed the statistics and also the detailed context of the global higher education, private higher education, and also the what is kind of the unique feature of the Asian private higher education and also the Asian private higher education researcher. So thank you so much, and we are looking forward to Dr. Levy's talk today. So thank you, and I'd like to hand over to Dr. Levy. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate the generous introduction and certainly the opportunity to address such a fine series as this has been, really, for so many of us interested in comparative higher education. I thank the organizers. I will plan to leave ample time at the end for questions, comments. This is, as Aki referred to, it's a big moment for Profi. I guess our 25th anniversary, but also the launching of a book series, which may go very far, but will go at least to 6 volumes and opens right now with, fittingly enough, a volume on Asia. It will be followed shortly by a volume on public policy, and then before long with another tandem regional volume on Latin America and a topic focus, which would be accreditation of higher education institutions. And then we'll move on from there. We're happy to bring the first volume to your attention and also the series in general, in case any of you are interested in joining somewhere along the way. Profi, of course, has a website, and you can easily connect to it, and most of the essential information about us, except our dirty little secrets, is posted there. Then my own book came out just within this last year. It's been something I've been working on directly for decades, and it has an immodest scope of the entire world, but it is noteworthy for our purposes here today to emphasize that even though we're talking about the entire world, the majority of the private higher education enrollments in the world are indeed in Asia. Asia is the biggest continent, and it's the biggest continent for this subject matter. So we're here today at a suitable intersection. Now, I don't pose as an expert on Asia. I wasn't trained in the regional affairs, and I didn't have the first half of my career with that much involvement, though I was fortunate enough to have colleagues like Aki with me for more than 25 years. But in any case, I made my own professional turn from a focus on Latin America to a focus on the world about 25 years ago with the start of Profi. So when I speak of Asia, I don't speak as a specialist, but I'm looking at Asia in comparative perspective. That's my disclaimer. My claimer, so to speak, or my bold claim for a talk tonight, so that it's not just broad strokes, is that in Asia, as in the world as a whole, private higher education reflects limitations on the state more than state strengths. Although, of course, private higher education in some respects reflects state strengths, if we take the evidence overall, I'd say it's much more preponderant as showing limitations on the state. Yes, I do think the state has been overall somewhat more prominent in Asia when it comes to the development of private higher education than it has been elsewhere, but not by as much as is generally depicted. And in fact, my corollary claim for the talk would be that the differences between Asia and the world when it comes to the broad subject matter of private higher education are really less between Asia and the world than they are reflected, in fact, within Asia itself. So that private higher education in the world is not just one thing, but scholarship is unfolding many patterns of private higher education, and there are few, if any, that you can't simultaneously find within the breadth of Asia itself. So I'm going to proceed first by turning to some slides, the PowerPoint that will focus on size. And I would say that size is one of the respects in which a general impression is that there's a big difference between Asia as a whole and the world when it comes to private higher education, but there really isn't, or isn't much anymore. And then after taking that up on the mostly quantitative side, we'll switch from the PowerPoint to a more in-depth look at the state, where I will focus on the theme that even when it comes to the state, Asia is more similar and overlapping of the world than it is distinct from it. So we see here just the two books that we referred to. And if we can turn to table 2.1, these all come from the second chapter of A World of Private Higher Education. Well, we're showing the Profi website, which we should show and show off. And actually, all these tables are represented either exactly or in close form to what I would be showing directly from my own book. So if we could get to table 2.1. Yes. We're looking at the first year for which we have comprehensive global data, or pretty comprehensive, is 2000. And the last year we have a full global data set, 2015. We'll have 2020 before long, but it won't change the picture much. So if for our purposes today, we jump right to Asia, and Asia is about the third row down versus global, the last row. As of the year 2000, whereas private higher education captured 41% of higher education total in Asia, almost the highest in the world at that point. For the globe, it was still 28.3%. So a not gigantic gap, but a significant gap where Asia was indeed high in its private higher education share. It's of course astronomical in its raw number of private higher education already by 2000. If we jump to 2015, however, we see that the Asian proportional inclination to private higher education is greatly diminished. And not so much because things change in Asia, though there is change within Asia, but primarily because the globe catches up, so to speak. There is a worldwide privatization trend reflected in many ways, including the private over total share of higher education enrollment. And we see it continuing on until 2015 at least, so that Asia is not as far in front of the world as it had been. We'll take a quick look just to show you table 2.2, but that will be mostly for you to play with in the future if you're interested, because it's an immensely long and complicated table as it tries to encompass all the countries of the world, though grouped by region. It's just too large for us to peruse together today, but I would point out that under Asia, we divide into the different principal regions of Asia. And so you can see right here, thank you for showing, we have the Asia, if you go to 2015, the 37.2 that we just showed, but then a breakdown by sub-region. So starting with Central and Western Asia. The most pronounced thing really between 2000 and 2015 is that East Asia, thanks again, goes from a private percentage of 44.7, extremely high, and I would have declared that alone as exceptional between Asia and the world, 44.7%, about double the world percentage at the time. But of course, this is East Asia. This isn't all of Asia. But what we do see in East Asia, as we home in on that, is that between 2000 and 2015, the private percentage drops from an exceptionally high figure to a figure that's actually under the global average. And in one word, the explanation for that is fairly easy. China. China comes on board with massifying higher education, and its private share of higher education is not high. It's low by global standards. So I'm going to pass just with that maybe tantalizing tidbit from table 2. And if we roll all the way to tables 4 and 5, it may take a minute. All that I really want to show there is that for both 2000 and 2015, private higher education globally is made up very heavily of private higher education in a select set of countries, very large countries with very large higher education systems, but actually the concentration of private higher education there is even higher. And what's of particular note, without going over it in detail here, is that so many of those largest countries are Asian. When we get to beyond the top 10, we get to the next 10, Latin America takes precedence, but we're in the top 10, and notwithstanding the United States still being one of the giants and Brazil being in there, we're looking mostly at Asian countries. The last table we could look at maybe table 6 just very quickly. All that does is show, again, you could look at it in more detail another time, that none of what we're depicting by regions is unduly skewed by one particular country going counter to a regional trend. So what we've done in this table is take out the one largest private higher education country, and then even the largest two, and it shows that we don't change the averages too much. In Asia, that's a little complicated because if you take out India, you lower the private percentage a lot, but you put, if you take out India, you lower the private higher education percentage a lot, but if you take out China, you raise the private higher education share a lot. But But other than that, the regional is fairly reflective of the internal composition within the regions. Now, the last slide, so it won't get too tedious, is slide 2.7. And here I would call your attention. It's not that there's a big difference between 2000 and 2015 as to the share of private higher education development in either the developed or the developing world. But what is striking is that as recently as 2000, only slightly more than half of the globe's private higher education was in the developing world. Only slightly more than half. The developing world and the developed world were relatively equal. Back at that time, the United States was the largest private higher education enrollment power. But by 2015, that's vastly changed. And the developing world has more than 3 times the private enrollment that the developed world has. It isn't that it didn't grow in the developing world. Private higher education did grow. I say privatization is worldwide, but it's an intensely developing world phenomenon in this century. What that winds up in terms of Asia is really not so simple, because Asia is the one, by our division of 7 regions of the world, which we're not showing here, but Asia is the one that encompasses not only a good deal of the developing world, but a good deal of the developed world, unlike Europe, for example. So Asia, while it was heavy on the developed side with Japan and South Korea back in 2000, by 2015, even though those powers slow in their growth, the rest of Asia picks up the slack. So we can shut off the slides for now, and I thank Professor Chow for that help. And would turn from the question of size, where I'm arguing that Asia is not particularly exceptional. You have countries that have higher than the global average. You have countries that have lower than the global average. You have subregions, in fact, that have higher than the global average, and subregions that have lower. So turning from size to even the question of the state, my argument is that it's perception more than reality that the state is strikingly more central in private higher education development in Asia than it is elsewhere in the world. And I think that we get a good handle on that when we start with the sub-regional breakdown I've been speaking about. I'll explain more in a minute, but basically, when impressions arise about the strong state in Asia and how it's influenced or even controlled private higher education, I think that the examples that are invoked are overwhelmingly from East Asia. And that's principally Japan, South Korea, and to some extent Taiwan and Hong Kong, which are really small entities, but greatly overrepresented in the amount of study that's been done on them. When we pass from East Asia, however, to other subregions of Asia, it's a different picture, generally much less portrayed, much less studied. But I think from what we do know, it would be absurd to categorize most of these countries as having strong states that have mostly directed private higher education development. In Southeast Asia, even in Vietnam, even though still under communist rule, and here I would point again to Professor Chow and writing a most fascinating dissertation on private higher education development in Vietnam, and showing an awful lot of nuance about the role of the state there. And certainly very important, undeniably. But even in Vietnam, if you study closely, you see an awful lot that's initiative that is taken by private actors with some reaction by the state. And of course, Vietnam isn't Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is mostly Indonesia and the Philippines, which can't fathomably be categorized as strong states in the face of or in regard to private higher education development. If we go to South Asia, same thing. The biggest of the subregions, and India, by far the giant of private higher education, with over 20% of the world's higher education in India alone, and the Indian state hardly qualifies as a strong state controlling society to its will. The other subregion I look at is Central and Western Asia, and there the largest power is Iran. And you might say, well, Iran, they certainly have a super state controlling everything. Ayatollah state control. The best studies of the inner functioning of Iranian politics and society show no such picture, even though there's a tight control over certain matters of national security and foreign policy by a small elite. In fact, the state is very weak in Iran and very subject to capture by different parts of society, and by no means has the Iranian state particularly fashioned private higher education to its will. In fact, there's no religious private higher education in Iran. And what I do for a teaser in my own book is in the forward, I pose the hypothetical. If you took, on the one hand, an expert on Iranian politics and history and culture, who knows nothing in particular about higher education, and then you took someone, say from the audience here, who probably isn't at all an expert on Iranian politics or culture or history, but knows something about private higher education globally, who would make better guesses as to what private higher education in Iran looks like? And my answer is, it's the person who knew next to nothing about Iran, because it's the stamp of the patterns of private higher education that characterize what goes on in Iranian private higher education, not the will of the state imposed on society. So I would take just a couple of minutes to suggest some of the reasons that I think the role of the state is often exaggerated in Asia compared to the rest of the world. Here are just a few ideas I briefly mentioned. I think it's research being skewed. As Hugo and Aki point out in their book with Professor Jung, I guess some years ago, on research in higher education in Asia, it is highly concentrated in East Asia. They must have worked hard, judging by our own experience in Profi, to even find authors for some of the other chapters. But for Japan, China, South Korea, authors you could pick from trees. So there's much more written, there's much more documentation. And I think this skews the analysis, where Asia is often too conflated with what is really only, if at that, East Asia. I think there's also a related bias to an interpretation that there's something of Confucian tradition going on here that's kind of exotic and appealing to think. But my own view is that while there may be something to that, probably a lot has to do with what I go into throughout my book, and particularly in the final chapter, which is the thesis that there is a bias in the general public, and even more strongly among higher education experts and authors, for what I call, following others, the state supervisory model of higher education, that well-governed systems with well-formed states will follow a state supervisory model that's state-centered, largely state financed, that's based on the public interest, not divided by all sorts of competing, dirty private interests, coherent, articulated, planned, centrally coordinated. There's a strong bias in that favor. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I don't know what a best model would look like, but I do think I know this. It's a poor depiction of empirically how private higher education really functions in the world, which I argue throughout the book is much better depicted by a pluralist market model. And I think further that this state supervisory bias, which I think holds worldwide and may be particularly strong among scholars in Asia, on top of that, I think another impression of the strong state in Asia, from looking at East Asia a lot, comes from the fact that implicitly comparison is made vaguely with the United States. And the United States is seen as a place where the state is notoriously limited. Now, I don't want to get into the complexities of the United States, because for all I'm saying that Asia is not that exceptional, I turn around and argue, which I shouldn't admit here because it makes me a target, that there's one place that really is exceptional when it comes to private higher education development, and that's my own country, the United States. But that's a different argument for a different day. All I'm saying here is that I think the fact that when Asia is compared to the United States, it may look like Asia has a very strong state. If you compare Asia to most of the world, it may not look that way. Here's a further, what I consider to be paradox about the state. I think that scholars have over-attributed to the role of the state, but on the other hand, I think they've understudied the state. And this goes not only for Asian scholars, but for scholars worldwide of higher education. It's very easy to look at a string of laws and proclamations. It's very easy to look at the government claims of what they're going about each time. But I will say that I think the collective experience that Aki and Kwang and I had with the submissions of country case studies for this Asian book, which we do recommend, but there was a constant struggle in that authors of individual countries were highly inclined to write the current history of private higher education development in their country as a string of state regulations governing the subject matter, without due attention to what produced those pieces of legislation, the pressures, the fights, the conflicts behind that, and without due attention to all the private initiative that was often involved. So it's much easier to study private higher education and all of higher education that way, the series of laws that you can read, and you can read the claims for them, but the realities are very different. And here I raise an eye toward the third or fourth volume of this series, which is already well underway, which is a global volume on accreditation. If you look at the rules and you look at the claims and you look at the declared purposes of accreditation, I think there would be no escaping the conclusion that accreditation globally is a massive move to increase the role of the state in its control and direction of higher education. Accreditation, by and large, fits perfectly with the norms and logic of the state supervisory model. That's if you look at accreditation by the book, by what's declared, by the rules, by the declared motivations, and by the laws. But we're well into seeing advanced drafts of the chapters, and speaking as one co-editor, I've yet to find any evidence that accreditation has made any huge difference in, say, the private-public interface of different countries. Now, that may be debated, and we have a chapter on Japan itself in that book, which I gather will gather a lot of attention and maybe criticism. But I'm just saying at this point, what may be clear or seem clear on the surface or in theory may look a lot different on the ground. I see the reality of accreditation as not changing very much the pre-existing reality of private higher education alongside public in the world. So let me turn to conclude. What if Asia is not all that different as a whole from global patterns of private higher education development? Sure, it's different in some respects, but then again, every region has its own particular characteristics. Latin America is unique for having a majority of its enrollments in private higher education. But I would say for Latin America, the same as I would say for Asia, you can find almost every global pattern of private higher education and private-public difference reflected within Latin America itself. And so a big statement I would make about Asia is not that it's exceptional, but that it encompasses just about everything important that's found globally in private higher education. My book makes a major attempt to get within private higher education and break down the different patterns and types of institutions that we see and the relation of each to various parts of private actors and business and religion and other actors beyond higher education and usually beyond the state itself. And what I find repeatedly is that while there's increasing diversity within private higher education, as it grows, it gets more complex, there's more private diversity, but all that does is multiply patterns of private-public differentiation, which remain, despite some blurring between private and public sector, remain in Asia and in the world as profoundly decisive. And here, as I'm coming to the end, I'll just pick what is almost so simple that it gets underplayed: finance. For all that there are now some examples of some public financing of private higher education and some examples of private finance for public higher education, the striking thing is how dichotomous the basic picture remains. Public higher education is overwhelmingly funded by public money worldwide, and private higher education overwhelmingly by private money, increasingly diversified worldwide. A paradox of Asia is actually that to the extent that it's had a strong state in East Asia, that strong state has been able to impose tuition, where tuition is a darn hard thing for states to impose in most of the rest of the world, with somewhat weaker states. But by imposing tuition, the state is paradoxically limiting its own role in higher education by not being as much the primary financer as it is for other systems. This, of course, is a pattern that Asian scholars have recognized for a long time. And I would say pretty similar things for governance. While not as demonstrable as it is for finance, private-public distinctions are still pretty strong as to the way that private institutions are governed as opposed to public institutions. Despite lots of blurring, what we see is recreation within the private sector that shows these big differences once again. And a final remark in this context: even where we think we might at first see some important differences between Asian private higher education development and global, again, we can usually find the variation within Asia itself, and as a subpart of that, it often turns out that it's a world cycle of private higher education. So, for example, it may look like Asia has more for-profit higher education than the rest of the world. But in fact, if we break it down, what we see is that the older systems, largely in East Asia, don't allow for-profit private higher education. In the epoch in which private higher education was created and developed, private for-profit hardly existed in the world, at least legally. But after the 1980s and up to the present, countries that have founded their private higher education sectors in this contemporary time have seen internationally that for-profit is an available option. And so, again, you'll find the decisive difference as to whether it's for-profit is allowed or not. That decisive difference does not occur between Asia and the rest of the world so much as it occurs within Asia itself, as within the rest of the world. And the primary determinant is not whether it's Asian or non-Asian, it's when the private higher education system developed. A similar statement, I think, could be made about international branch campuses. So those are my views put out on a very large canvas, and certainly certainly exposed for anyone to quarrel with. And I have indeed left 21 minutes for that quarreling. Thank you.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much, Dan. It was a really great talk, very comprehensive. For the time being, we only have one comment by Jason. I'm sure others are on the way. I definitely have a couple of questions myself. So let me open the floor to Jason.
Well, thank you so much, Professor. It was really comprehensive and interesting talk. I also have a lot of questions, but just one question. In East Asia, one of the pressing issues now is all these demographic changes and declines, low birth rate. And then private sector is actually the first sector that is influenced by this low enrollment. So how do you see the effect of this demographic change to the East Asian private higher education? Thank you.
I have thought about that particular question, and I think I have an answer that I'm comfortable with, which is that on the one hand, and at first view, East Asia in particular has this striking thing about the demographic crisis and what the impact already is and is predicted to be on both higher education, in particular on private higher education. I see it as something where, yes, Asia has hit this phenomenon sort of first, but really in conjunction with another part of the world, which of course is Eastern Europe, which has had similar falls of population. And I think from there, in fact, maybe the best studied single case is Poland. So Poland alongside Japan and South Korea, which have been well studied, including by Aki in this regard, and in that very volume that's coming out, addresses this in depth. And what the Polish case finds, and I think confirms something that I hypothesized globally in a 2013 article, is that demographic decline will fall disproportionately hard on private sectors more than public ones, and therefore could stanch this proportional private growth, which took place mostly in the last century, though continued into this one. And even more specifically than that, will affect the non-elite portion. Again, we're not getting into my typology here, but will affect the non-elite portion. And you see that so well borne out in the Polish case. It's all these private institutions classified as non-elite that have been demand absorbing. When there's no excess demand, their main rationale disappears, and they're very, very vulnerable. Whereas the semi-elite institutions and others do have rationales and means to withstand the onslaught. So I do think it's visibly Asia, and I wouldn't say that there's not something special about Asia being out in front here. But again, it's particularly East Asia, though we see something of this already in less developed countries like Indonesia. But it's principally East Asia. And so it's variation within Asia, while other parts of Asia are not seeing demographic decline. And we do see in the rest of the world, likewise, a mix. Some of the most advanced countries, really most of the developed countries in the world, other than the United States, have hit something of demographic decline. And I think that the private sector, particularly non-elite, is especially vulnerable. So I think it's a very important question for taking sort of pre-existing theory and having it tested by real-world events.
We don't have any new questions, so I'll ask some questions of my own. I have one. I've just returned from Europe. I was at the chair conference, and there I was in a quite interesting session where some Italian colleagues presented on the evolution of online education, which interestingly, it's owned by corporations, but they didn't really associate it with private education. So that is already a first kind of interesting nuance that they did. And what they found was quite interesting, because basically their argument is COVID changed things. Public universities did not kind of follow through. Actually, private universities also not follow through. Who followed through was these companies offering degrees. So do you see this as a trend? And they show basically the enrollment in private education, in private universities. So what's your view on this? And
yeah.
Observation that I would like to get your comments on as well, which
Yeah.
is they looked at the students that were participating in these online kind of degrees, and what they've seen was, before, who participated in these online degrees would be the non-traditional students, or the students, who didn't have very good GPAs to get into the university, so on and so forth. But now they're starting to see a proportion of these students growing, which is actually top students, that instead of going to the public universities, they prefer to go to these online kind of training. So how do you see these trends, these two particular trends that I mentioned? Because to me, they were fascinating. Thank you.
So let me follow my pattern that I took for the talk itself. First, I'll start with a disclaimer, and then I'll go to my claims, which may be exorbitant. But the disclaimer is that I think that distance education is so new and so complex. And I'm 75, and I'm leaving it to the rest of you to figure it out. That's the disclaimer. However, I do think that in touching on the distance education, you're touching on a huge wild card for private higher education and higher education. So in the Latin America volume that we're doing now, the chapter on Brazil, and Brazil, if you caught it in one of the earlier slides, is one of the private higher education giants, both in total number and in percentage private. And unlike in the rest of Latin America, that's been that way for 100 years. Huge private. And, you could find over time some private public blurring. But what's the salient thing going on now? The salient thing going on now is an explosion of distance education. And who's doing it? In Brazil, it's the private sector that's doing it. And it's not just the private sector. You had a very important few words in there. It's not even the pre-existing private ones so much as new actors coming on the scene, which I take as illustrating perfectly what I'm talking about as the regeneration of private public differences. As private sectors have grown, they've not just gotten, as isomorphism would have it, to be more of the blah, blah, same. There's, of course, some of that, but there's lots of dynamism, too, with all sorts of new and previously unpredicted forms coming about. the international branch campus is really something of that. Distance education is like a form of higher education, and it cross-cuts so many other forms, corporate or nonprofit. It could be done in either sector. When Profi did kind of a quick analysis of the impact of COVID on private-public balances in different countries, one of the most striking things to me was how vivid it was that in Argentina, where the state has been somewhat stronger than in most countries in Latin America, the state would be somewhat stronger, the public university somewhat stronger, but stronger also translates into bureaucratic inertia. So the University of Buenos Aires, the most prestigious, largest university in the country, was very slow to do anything. It didn't want to go online, despite COVID, because that wasn't the way university courses should be taught. But in the private universities, they were looking at it differently. And then others came on to form new institutions. So I think there's at least that potential. So we have these scattered examples from different countries, but I think that it's something that as leaders, if you will, in higher education research, we want to make sure is on the agenda. If you're going to write about higher education in a country or about private sectors or private-public balances, which sector is taking this up? You know, how is it getting into what sector? Is it, you know, what is higher education and what is not? I had a lot of trouble in dealing with numbers for India, which again, the largest, most important case, as to what was being counted as higher education and what not. And ultimately, we wanted to go with, you know, UN, UIS classification, but there were complicated decisions to make. And often institutions change levels. We all know institutions that were once higher secondary become higher education. And so all this has to be watched. And in some cases, you know, whether it's private institutions grabbing portions that previously of higher education population that previously would have gone to public, which is something I wrote a lot about in Latin America, how troubles in the public universities made many students in middle-class families available to private universities. They then had to go get them, but they were available, versus in some cases, actually private institutions, and including our main Profi expert in Mexico is writing his dissertation on non-elite institutions there. And even they are quite entrepreneurial. And they're not going after just easy excess demand. They're actually generating demand. And, you know, some public universities are feeling that they're getting pushed into doing that too. They generally don't like doing it. You know, it's governments asking to do it. But many private places either are flexible enough to do it. I'm not saying it's inherently a good thing. It's like many things. It comes with its upside and its downside. But just empirically, they are doing it more than public institutions are doing it, it seems. And if the existing private institutions don't do it, they're vulnerable to new actors coming in and doing it. So they're going after traditional students, and they're generating demand from people who hadn't thought about higher education before.
All right. We have a next question by Monique, and then Molly. So Monique, please.
Yes. Hi, Professor Daniel. This is Monique. Thanks for your great talk. I know you are very knowledgeable and have a lot of findings. So I'm curious, could you please share which findings surprise you most? That is the most unexpected finding, and that means which is the most shocking. Thank you.
You know, I'm not sure I have a handy answer there, and you would think that it would be on my mind. I can think of it more, and it's a little bit eluding your question. I can think of it more in terms of a research career. I didn't start in education. I started in political science. I did my dissertation on questions of state versus society in Mexico, and I just chose the university as a societal institution that thought hadn't been looked at very much in that regard. But my interest was in how far the extent of state power reached. And my big surprise there, while I was doing that, well, there were two big surprises. One relevant to the study was that the state wasn't nearly as powerful, so this has been something of a lifelong thing, as political science on Mexico had depicted the state, or as higher education experts looking at situations in which public universities depended 100% on public money, the higher education literature, resource dependency, and all that, you'd figure they wouldn't have much autonomy. I was stunned by how much autonomy they had. Not that they weren't controlled in some ways, but Latin American public universities, including Mexican, had considerable autonomy, despite being dependent on public funds. So that was the surprise within the study. But the surprise alongside the study was that when I posed the question to myself, I never imagined private universities. And it was only while I was in the process of studying the public universities that I got this growing sensation, hey, something's going on here. There's this different kind of animal that's kicking around in the sand too, and it's not insignificant. And so that was a surprise to get into that, but I still saw it as a Latin, I remember I was a Latin American at the time, I saw it as basically a Latin American phenomenon. And then it wasn't until 2000 when the Ford Foundation, this is like light years ago, it's unthinkable such a thing would happen now, but the Ford Foundation came to me and said, we like the kind of work you've been doing. What would you like us to fund you for? You know, a scholar's dream. And at that time, you know, I got this surprise in Latin America, and I studied private higher education there, and I've not been studying it since, but I've been surprised repeatedly at how much I think stuff that I saw going on in Latin America is happening elsewhere in the world. And so if I can go back to Hugo's question, because I meant to say this before, in November, December, I was in Europe, principally Germany, and here's the reigning question in Germany, and it's all government-funded research, 21 research projects, can you imagine, funded by government all around the particular question, why is private higher education growing here? We're Germans. This is Western Europe. We have an established public university tradition. It's great. Our universities aren't falling apart. This isn't Bangladesh or Peru. And on top of that, our public university tuition is nothing. It's free. How then in the world could students be leaving us and flocking to private? But we see it in country after country. And so I've actually done some stuff, and we hope maybe we'll have a volume on Western Europe. It's striking in almost every Western European country, the growth of the private higher education sector, not just in raw terms, but in proportion, is huge. And it's gotten to near 20%, which means it's not that far anymore from the global average. And this is, talk about surprises. It's surprising and a shock to public university figures in these countries. But it's Spain, it's Italy, it's Finland, if we can count that too. Greece is the last Western European country to surrender the public monopoly. The new legislation allows private universities. So if I get caught up in the idea that this is global, and that even where there seem to be, you know, regional atypicalities, they tend, not all of them, but they tend to get ironed out over time. And the biggest growth in private higher education is bound to come in Africa, which previously had the lowest share of private higher education enrollment, but it's going to grow. And I think the Western European, when this gets out, so to speak, to the higher education research community more broadly, it will be a surprise and a shocker, and will call that much more attention to private higher education, because it can no longer be ignored as something just annoying or marginal or religious or US. I mean, it no longer can be relegated that way. It can be criticized roundly, and it can be, a lot of aspects of the growth can be lamented, but they absolutely must be studied.
All right. Molly, it's your turn, please.
Yes. Hi, everyone, and special hello to all friends. I have a question. It's not directly related to private higher education. It's a much broader issue. Dan, you said you are 75, I'm 76, and I have not been into the classroom for more than 20 years now. I would like to hear from you and others, how are the university handling AI tools these days? And how do you think it should be handled? That's my question.
AI, we have family fights over that. But fortunately, I'm not that engaged in it because I don't feel I understand it well enough to, you know, I don't have any insights on it. Anything I can think of has been said so many times over, and I must say I'm grateful in this respect. I love many aspects of teaching, but I'm very glad that I don't have to deal with the questions raised by.
That's exactly how I feel.
Well, so do what I do. Don't teach anymore. There's a long tradition. This is
Yes, please.
Whether it's in research centers or other means, brain drain. Sometimes the challenges are larger than we are. But I thank you for the question, and I must say, when you talk about friends in the audience, I think all of us have been in our careers also students of Molly Lee. That's one of the first authors that I ever read about private higher education, a real pioneer, on a very exciting case. And she too is in the book on Asia, so now you get an idea how good it really is.
All right. So the next question is from Jashin. Are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, perfect.
Hi.
Yes, please. Ask away.
I just have a question that in China we have a kind of a type of education that is an international campus in China. We can call it Center for Foreign Cooperative University. And in mainland China, this kind of university is different from public university, but they receive a lot of fundings from government and they have lower autonomy, as Dan said. So I'm curious, is this kind of university public or private? How do you?
Yeah, maybe someone could help me because I heard lots
so
of the
basically,
words and I missed others on breaking up. So
yeah, so
particular
basically
what institution is in question here?
It's the China international branches or the Sino-foreign joint venture universities, if they are private or public.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you how one of our Chinese Profi specialists who did a lot of research on that set of few universities looked at it, and she looked at it as private universities, at least a few of them, and classified them as semi-elite. And now's not the place for me to try to remember the different reasons, but she took up the substance of your question and the challenges to classification, but decided that, I've always been clear in my work that I start with an identification of private and public by nothing more than what the law of the country says. And so the designated identification of the university as private or public. And she's finding that, you know, the public authorities in China, and they ultimately have to give their data to the UN. Well, they don't have to, but they voluntarily participate to give their data to the UN that classifies every institution as to whether it's higher education and then whether it's private or public. So, I mean, there's no such UNESCO requirement that they make that breakdown for nonprofit and for-profit, which could help researchers a lot. But for private and public, they do it. So the Chinese government is doing it that way. I've never wanted to make empirical assumptions. I've always wanted to leave that up for investigation. What do the private institutions do? What do the public institutions do? So yes, there are private institutions that are overwhelmingly funded by government. In fact, the UN has a classification of government-dependent private institutions, but they're still private. And I go into those definitional issues a lot in chapter 1 of my book. But even though I said before, it's an overwhelming rule that 99-point-something% of private institutions are privately funded, while public institutions are publicly funded, there are anomalies. They're not particular to any one region. We see them in Europe. We see them in China. The government feels it has sufficient purpose to fund heavily. I mean, obviously, in the United States, it's not done directly, but our private research universities, for their research, are funded very heavily by government. So even in this so-called paragon of private higher education in the United States, we're actually very mixed in our privateness and publicness. So I don't have a great problem myself in classifying and identifying and simply doing it all transparently, including trying to tackle the thorny issues like the ones that get raised in your question and spell it out. And then, you know, if someone wants to make a different choice, that person will make a different choice and spell out those rationales, and they can be publicly debated. But I do think it's interesting that that the Chinese state would choose to utilize such a mixed format. I mean, because you could say, oh, it's a nearly all controlling state. Why don't they just have a public institution that does these things? What do they need to mess around with any private designation? Can't they control their own bureaucracy? Well, these are, you know, levels of complications that obviously would take a China expert like the one we have in Profi to look into more deeply.
All right, we are quite short on time, so I will only allow one last question. I would like Aki to ask the last question. Aki, can you ask the question that you have ready?
Thank you very much. So basically I really think that you made two cautions to the maybe the higher education researchers in Asia. One is that we tend to have the kind of view of the state control model, and that is not necessarily the only way to discuss about the private higher education. The other one is that don't look only the United States, right? You know, I still remember that in my dissertation on the Japanese private higher education, that you made a good, very wonderful suggestion that what do you why do you want to compare with the Brazil and Japan? I never thought about that at the time, but it's really make a kind of very big breakthrough for us. And my question is that since in your book, if my understanding correct, that you wrote that within the global trend, there is some tendency that the state control over the private higher education has increased in the from at least from year 2000 to 2015 or that until today, and as a global trend. So and then now my basic question is that the US it seems that now, you know, kind of the very big turmoil or the battle that the state are trying to increase the control to the private higher education somehow. And do you think that the US is also the country case that are receiving some global trends or the global impact in their own very unique transformation of the private higher education in United States? That's my question.
Yeah, I could be very vulnerable on this because I really am uttering one message about the world and a somewhat different message about my own country. And, you know, as comparativists, we always face this question. Do we just see greater detail about what we're closest to? And so, I mean, I've had this, I don't know how informally, but over the decades, and one of the pleasures of having so many international students is that they generally come with an idea that what's going on in their country, say in higher education, is special, even unique, and it's not found elsewhere. And usually there's a grain of truth in that. But as a comparativist, I don't think that way. And I think that it's unusual that we find those things, and generally there are broader patterns. But I do think that the whole political, economic, social, cultural history and development of private versus public in the United States was essentially largely opposite to what it would be in the rest of the world, which is why I was lucky that I latched on to Latin America early, because Latin America, with its European tradition, was much more in the mainstream of the world flow, rather than getting misdirected, so to speak, by the United States. But then on top of that, I really think I can only, you know, it's my honest opinion, that the US is in such an unusual turmoil now that it's impossible to make sense out of it in comparative terms or even historical terms for the United States. I mean, higher education is getting turned upside down depending upon which party is elected to the presidency and the Congress. I mean, that's so unlike our history, and it gives so little stability by which to judge anything. The phenomenon of a supposedly conservative political regime being extremely harsh against private universities is paradoxical, to say the least. But of course, part of that paradox gets unraveled by the fact that our major private research universities are, and this goes back to the Chinese case we were just talking about, they're really hybrids in terms of privateness and publicness. I mean, there's no doubt Harvard is a private university. On legal definition, there's no doubt about that. But it's a private university which gets a huge amount of its money indirectly from government, particularly federal government, and is not immune to the potential consequences of that. So matters of political norms and trust have usually provided buffers and protections, but in this phenomenally unusual era, those break down, and the raw vulnerability that does take you back to resource dependency theory. Ultimately, the funder can claim power, even if under normal political circumstances that doesn't happen. But I haven't the faintest idea where this goes 2 and 4 and 8 years from now. But and as far as whether there's a general global tendency to more state control over private higher education, I'm wary of that myself, because I do think that it's susceptible to something that was thematic in this talk, that if you look at the rules and the laws and the government statements, you would take something like the whole quality assurance movement and say that in many countries it's largely motivated by trying to curb the private institutions. The surprise growth of private higher education, unanticipated, outside the central plan, devastating to state supervisory notions. So let's get this under some control, put coherence in it. Some top-down controls, regulations is a natural state supervisory response. But this is why we study it. What actually becomes of it? And I talked about struggle between editor and author. Say in the Asia volume, we had healthy back and forth, as you know, Aki, and sometimes over a lot of time with a lot of effort. Well, that same experience, you'd be happy to know that you spared yourself this one on accreditation, but the same thing is going on where many of the authors initially go to the rules, and it looks like this ongoing, well, there was this accreditation thing, and then that didn't quite work out, so we get a reform of it. But what does the reform tell you? It has to tell you in part that the great claims for what it was going to do in terms of getting hold of the private institutions didn't work out that way. So whether there's really more state control or just more visible state efforts in the face of still ever diversifying private higher education. So go back to Brazil, go back to the question on distance education. This is a new freak animal out there, the distance education. You know, we think it's been around for a while, but it's never been this big with the prospect of it exploding. And so it poses itself as a grand threat to regulatory schemes, right? I mean, as scholars, we can see that much. And so naturally, the state, in most cases, will try to gain some control over it. But how much will it gain control over it? In what forms? Will it want it to be public rather than private, or private heavily regulated? I think all that's before us, and nothing in all the lessons we can have from our research to date gives us the answer.
All right. I think we can close the session for now. Let me thank the speaker for this really interesting perspective on really global private higher education. I think we need to have more of this kind of global comparative studies and learn from one another. Thank you so much for Aki for initiating this whole idea of the seminar. It was great. And thank to all of you who asked questions and participated and attended the session. We're going to continue with other seminars, and we'll let you know if you join our newsletter what they will be. All right, so let me take the opportunity to wish you all a very nice day, or a good night, evening, probably at this time. Okay, so okay, bye-bye, everybody. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.